Just a quick show of hands. How many people have even heard of Waze? Excellent. That's very good. OK, so when people think of Waze, they tend to think of a navigation application that's crowdsourced. But that's sort of old news. What we've become over the years is one of the largest sources of data on congestion, on traffic, on urban mobility patterns. And about 4 years ago, I thought it was important for us to take all of that information and begin to share it with cities to see if we could have a much better impact about how we're weaving across our world. And that was really the idea of data being a critical part of infrastructure in cities. So this program was called the Connected Citizens Program. And today, it's currently used by 500 cities around the world, covering about 2 billion people that now have access to this data, all anonymized, but incidents, closures, origin, destination, information critical to making cities efficient. Each one of those cities is using the data in a different way, and it's kind of like pilot programs. I'm going to walk you through just a couple. Jakarta has some of the worst traffic I've ever experienced in my life. They have about 2 million commuters every morning. And it's an impossible process. For them, they wanted information about testing new policies. They tested carpool lanes, or HOV. They tested license plate restrictions. So depending on the last 2 digits of your license plate number, it would determine what route you could take. Because they were able to use data before and after that they never had access before, they could figure out in just 1 month that they reduced their travel time by 19% in morning commute. This was huge. And it wasn't just about Jakarta being able to roll that out to a long-term strategy. It was about them sharing it with every other city that's in the program. Because if we're going to start looking at this data and looking at the city as a lab, it's critical that we start sharing the results of those experiments. Here's another one. When Rio was preparing for the Olympics, they were going to have to bring 1 million new visitors to a city of only 6 million people. There was absolutely no policy strategy that could change that. We had to add infrastructure. So we actually figured out, based on the traffic trends, where to create lanes. And we created 3 new lanes. And for the purposes of adding all of these new people, we were able to reduce congestion by 27%. Now, as some of you know, there is an infinite amount of demand. If you create a lane, people will use it. But given that this was a short-term problem that needed to be solved, this was the best strategy. Again, data helped solve that problem. And it's not just congestion. Take emergency response. 70% of 911 calls for crashes that would be 911, they come into Waze before they're phoned in. That means that emergency responders are getting to the scene of an incident, to a crash, 4 to 7 minutes earlier than they would otherwise. So there's all kinds of uses for this data that we're just trying to figure out now. One last note from Ghent in Belgium. They recently closed off the center of the city to cars, and they had to create 2,000 changes to the base map in their city. Signs, roads closed, unimaginable. Because we have a community and an ecosystem of map volunteers all around the world, they were able to work with them in their traffic operations center. So the first day that the city reopened, we knew exactly where they were going to need to go, and Waze was the only application that allowed that. That was just simply because we were the only ones who care enough to keep the data updated and fresh at any moment. So far, they have reduced crashes by 30%, so that was one of their primary goals. Pollution another, but we're still collecting data there. This is really all about humans. The data is one thing, but this is 150 of those cities that just got together in person in New York City a month ago, sharing code, sharing algorithms, sharing data strategies. And that's the exact kind of community that we need to have happen if we're going to be successful in the future of our cities. At the end of the day, we need to get cars off the road, though. Right? We can think about autonomy, we can think about all of these future strategies, but we have too many cars on the road and too many cars with one person on the road. So now the trick is, before we even get to autonomy, how do we get people used to sharing? Carpool is one of those strategies that we're looking at now. We all feel this huge change that's happening in our cities, and we know that technology has a lot to do with it. We know that data has a lot to do with it. But that's breeding fear, it's breeding anxiety, it's breeding confusion. And so I think the most important thing we need to figure out is how we're going to work better with citizens, not just with the cities, to make sure that we're guiding the technology and technology is not happening to us. You heard some positive and negative stories about different technologies. I'm going to walk you through 3 that are going to drastically change our cities in the next 5 years. So we all know that we're headed toward flying autonomous vehicles, and that's going to save everything. But the detail that's important there is the amount of infrastructure that is already going to the existing car culture. This is Los Angeles County. 7% of the square footage is roads. Another 14% is parking. In Sao Paulo, that's 25% is just in parking. Then you've got retail and other services that are drastically changing because of the way mobility is changing. That's another 18%. And then you have small things like gas stations. But what this means is that we're going to be able to get back 15 to 40% of our cities if we do this well. What would we do with that space? And the reason it's important to think about this now is because technology companies, my company, people are going to make decisions whether or not we're ready. So everyone has to be a part of this conversation. What do we do with that space that we get back? And every city is going to make a different decision. Energy, affordable housing, schools. We all need that space. So let's think about how we want to use it. The second thing is blockchain. We've heard a lot about it, but it's already being used today in city governments. Dubai is planning on being the first fully blockchain-enabled government by 2020. Now, every government is trying to figure out how this works, but there's something really fundamental that's important here, which is that right now, if you want to do an infrastructure project, you want to make a change to your city, there's about 5 really vocal people that are going to show up at the meetings and tell you what you want them to do. There's no good way to track what the bulk of people want. Blockchain can be a great facilitator for that. That is a way to give people back their voice. And then the third technology is robots and AI. We've heard about this till the cows come home, but practically speaking, the time we spent driving in this era, we'll be able to get back. So that's time about 290 hours per year for the average commuter in the US. That's not even the interesting part. The interesting part is what's going to happen to jobs. 32 million people in the US are in the supply chain that has to do with the current vehicle structure and factory structure pre-AI. So this is really about going from big factory to big warehouse to big truck to big box retailer. That's all changing. And nobody knows exactly what it's going to look like. But one method is that we're all going to have these very distributed ways that we're going to be able to get our goods. So imagine that the vehicle itself is going to do lightweight manufacturing. So goods will be created as they're being delivered. So this whole supply chain is going to be compressed. What does this have the opportunity to give us? Time and money back. So this is the optimist's look at what cities can have. But based on these changes, it's space, it's voice, it's time, it's money. But it all starts on the street, because that's where everything happens. It's where movements happen. Today, you might have one street, and on a certain day of the week, it's used for a farmer's market. On a certain morning of the week, it might have a restriction based on license plates, for example. Another street might have a congestion price associated with it. Our streets are becoming incredibly dynamic. If we're able to combine the technologies that I just mentioned, imagine that on every street, it will have, based on what all of the citizens want to have happen there, a schedule, a dynamic schedule based on the needs of the citizens. So 6 to 9 a.m., it's for cars. 9 to 4 p.m., it's a pop-up co-working space. From then on, it's pop-up restaurants, goods, whatever, and then it's back to cars again. This is the kind of dynamic road building that's happening now. And we're excited to be working on a number of pilots in this space. But I think it's important that we realize as we're talking about jobs, as we're talking about all of these changes, that it has to start with who is being invited to the table. The truck drivers have to be there. The residents have to be there. And today, that's not exactly the case. So 3 big things in this new urban system I think are going to be critical. Obviously, we talked a lot about data, and that's about how to make a dynamic city. Then there's the adaptive, right? How are we going to respond to this? How do we transform our roads and our parking garages into new things that are going to be useful? The high lineification of cities. Then there's new road types. But it's about how are we going to be supportive? What are the educational programs? What are the ways that we're going to help people get from here to there? And that's going to take a certain level of support. And most importantly, it can't be that we say, OK, here's the educational program for the next 10 years, because those days are gone. The most important thing is that we start treating our cities as labs, that we test, that we share, and that we prepare our citizens to be able to test like that as well. Thank you very much.